Hey folks, back again with another vlog. This is Steven Universe Season 2, Episodes 3 and 4, aka Airing Order, Episodes 52 and 53, aka Production Order, Episodes 54 and 55, aka Joyride and Say Uncle. So starting with Joyride, I think the most significant thing here was Steven saying something that's been, I think, hinted at before, but I don't think it's been expressly stated, which is that he's worried that the gems resent him for essentially replacing his mom, that they blame him for the loss of his mom. And I think particularly with Pearl, there's not truth to that, but there's certainly stuff to base his fears on. Because we've already seen that Pearl was extremely dedicated to Rose. So, what does that mean? It's interesting because Pearl is like the one who's most mothering toward him, the one who's most, like, she's really the nurturer. Garnet and Amethyst have different relationships with Steve than she does. She's the one that's most like a stereotypical mom, especially stereotypical TV mom. So it's interesting that she's probably the one he's worried about the most as blaming him for replacing his mom. But I'm sure he feels that way about all of them because they all loved Rose. And I think he's also starting to worry about his own identity. You know, he's had this experience now. He's learned things about his origins that he didn't know. He's learned that he's part alien. He's met the other gems and they're terrible. He's learned that that in both worlds he's strange. It's strange in a way that empowers him, but still he doesn't quite fit in either world. On Earth, his gem powers make him stand out. On the gem ship, his human powers made him stand out. So it's understandable that he's having a lot of issues with his identity, and part of that is wondering, is he actually a separate person from his mom, or does the fact that he has her gem make him her? In some sense. Certainly the homeworld gems seem to basically regard him as a strange form that Rose has elected to take for reasons that they don't quite understand. So that's probably really confusing to him, especially because I'm not sure we've ever gotten his precise age, but he's clearly at about the age of developing first crushes, so I'm guessing 10 to 13, somewhere in that range. And that really is the time of your life when you start solidifying who you are, where you start saying, separating between me and not me, and experimenting with different possibilities of who you might be, and figuring out exactly who that is. By coincidence, I happened to be talking to a friend today who works in a school and helped start a gay-straight alliance at this school. And they were overwhelmed by the number of 7th and 8th graders that joined. But to me that makes total sense that there'd be a flood of them, because that really, I would expect that to be the age where saying, I'm gay, I'm bisexual, I'm a lesbian, I'm trans, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, all of those things, those identities, where you really start to say, I mean, obviously there are people who do it before, but I feel like that's likely to be the age where a lot of people start saying, well, no, I'm different. I'm me, not the rest of you. Because that's the age where everyone says that in many different ways. And that's the age that Stephen is at, I think. So he's expressing and exploring that, but at the same time, there comes with that, with the desire to establish who you are and to say, this is me, all of that is not me. There comes this fear of putting up too much of a wall, of disconnecting too much, of being too different. And so, that age, there's also an intense desire to fit in, which sometimes expresses itself as a desire to punish people who don't. I'm glad to see that there's none of that from Stephen's friends. But, you can see him wanting to fit in with them. Especially when they're an older crowd, they're all teenagers and he's 10, 11, 12. That's tough. And he's trying really hard to fit in with the big kids. And it means he does some things that aren't maybe the smartest thing. But, he means well and he's just trying to explore who he is. And he has good impulses, If he had stuck to his guns and been like, no, we shouldn't play with Peridot's ship. By the way, bless you, Steven Universe, for finally teaching me how to pronounce Peridot. I have been uncertain ever since I first encountered the word 15 years ago playing Final Fantasy IX and had no clue what it was or how to pronounce it, but apparently it's Peridot. Thank you. But yeah, if he hadn't done that, there'd be no episode. But he had the good impulse. He just let it be overridden by his desire to seem cool in front of his older friends, which is understandable. It's completely understandable. Steven makes mistakes, but he's a good kid. Main other thing I wanted to comment on Joyride is for half the episode, it really bugged me how familiar Sour Cream sounded. Could not figure out why he sounded so familiar. And then about halfway through, it clicked. It's the same voice actor as the robot from Symbionic Titan, doing almost exactly the same voice. Very slight difference. Sour Cream is a little bit less monotone, but it's still this kind of slightly nasal, but also slightly gravelly voice, which is not a combination you hear very often. It's an interesting voice. Very distinctive. So let's move on to Say Uncle. I now understand why Shane commissioned Uncle Grandpa, and I am glad I watched it at the beginning of the month instead of the end. Because I have a feeling that had I not watched Uncle Grandpa before watching Say Uncle, I would have been very confused and hated it. But because I watched Uncle Grandpa, I actually really enjoyed it. It was really interesting to see the two shows juxtaposed with one another, to see kind of their very different aesthetics blending. Because it made me realize Steven Universe is really, I've commented on this before, many people I'm sure have. Steven Universe is very anime influenced. You can tell that it's being made by people around my age or a little younger who, were young children in a time when Western animation wasn't great, and as, either as kids or as teens, got really into anime. And it's the same anime, the anime they reference are the same ones that I think of as the big ones from when I was a teenager, Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, Revolutionary Girl Utena, Neon Genesis Evangelion. It's, the big 90s anime, at least in the US. Those were the big ones. Plenty of other references I haven't commented on, but tons of references to mostly 90s anime. And it kind of wears that influence on its sleeve. It's a really obvious influence. Whereas Uncle Grandpa has its influence from a very, very different source. When I did my vlog on Uncle Grandpa, episode 1, I talked about the way it played with notions of space and perspective and visual puns. And it occurred to me, thinking about this episode, that really everything Uncle Grandpa is doing, in terms of all that strange space and all that kind of stuff, is really just an evolution of Wile E. Coyote painting a tunnel on a cliff wall, and the Roadrunner runs through it with no problem, and then Wile E. Coyote tries to figure out how he just ran straight through a wall, and a train comes out of the tunnel and hits him. That's the same logic. And once you start thinking about that, it becomes really clear Uncle Grandpa is rooted heavily in the work of people like Tex Avery and Chuck Jones. Kind of the big golden age, slapsticky but also pretty postmodern cartoon directors. Think Roadrunner, of course. Duck Amuck is a brilliant example of Chuck Jones's style. Think, a lot of Tom and Jerry for like the more slapsticky elements. This is what these guys were good at and what they were doing. And Uncle Grandpa is clearly drawing very heavily on that tradition of animation. So, given all of that, it's really interesting to see the two aesthetics kind of jammed up against each other, invading one another's spaces, because they don't fit together at all, with one exception that I'll get to. Uncle Grandpa just does not work as a character in Steven Universe. He's very, they refer to him as like this reality warping entity, and that's the thing. Steven Universe is a little bit more serious. It has something approximating rules, and Uncle Grandpa is this walking force of chaos, which, by the way, explains exactly why Pearl is utterly enraged by him, Garnet is quietly determined to stop him, and Amethyst thinks he's kind of cool. Because he's chaos incarnate. He's kind of an interesting character to put into Steven Universe in that sense. In my vlog of Uncle Grandpa, I talked about how the very concept of the character creates a mental space that we just don't want to go into. You can't have an Uncle Grandpa without some kind of incest. Well, okay, technically you can, but it would be Uncle Step-Grandpa. If, like, your paternal uncle married your widowed maternal grandmother. No actual incest there. It's still pretty weird. And would be your step-grandfather. Anyway, really, there's no way except for incest, and that's not a space you want to go into, yet it's a space, when you introduce into Steven Universe, it kind of becomes necessary. Somebody has to comment on the weirdness of the name Uncle Grandpa. And I think they nailed it perfectly with Garnet's reaction of, so he's both Greg's brother and dad. That would explain a lot. It's mean. Greg is a really great guy, but it's funny. And it's a way of commenting on it without getting into gross detail that does not belong on a children's show. But yeah, he just doesn't fit. And the conflict inevitably results in him, throwing up the plot hole, and then they transition into Uncle Grandpa's world. And Stephen doesn't really fit there better than Uncle Grandpa fits in his world. Because Stephen is kind and gentle and curious. Which means he wants to have a guided tour, meet everyone, befriend them, have pleasant little interactions with them. It does not really create the opportunities for slapstick that Uncle Grandpa thrives on. Stephen just isn't weird enough or confrontational about his not being weird. Like, Pearl would actually fit well into Uncle Grandpa as, like, maybe he comes to help a kid and she's, angry about it, complaining, trying to stop him, it's sort of an antagonistic role. But she would work well on that in Uncle Grandpa. Stephen doesn't, because he's not antagonistic about things that are weird. He's fascinated by them. But he's not accepting enough of them to be the kid that Uncle Grandpa takes around. Now keep in mind, I'm basing all of this on having seen one episode of Uncle Grandpa, but I feel like that episode did a pretty good job of laying out for me what I expect the show is, and certainly I didn't see anything in this crossover to contradict it. So they return to the white space, which probably isn't a reference to anything. It's just that's what blankness is when you're making a cartoon, unless it's Batman the Animated Series, and then blankness is black, because that series was done in a strange way. But for most cartoons, whether you're drawing it on a computer or on paper, white is, you start with white and then you put lines and colors on top of it. As you can see, I am an expert on how drawing works. You put lines and then colors and art happens. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I have absolutely no ability to draw or do anything in the visual arts whatsoever, and as far as I'm concerned, the ability to put lines on paper and have them become an image of something recognizable is essentially a form of witchcraft. It's good witchcraft. It's witchcraft that impresses me and makes me like you, but it's magic. You're doing something impossible. Anyway, the white space probably isn't a reference to anything. Probably it's just being blank, but the way that Garnet smashes it made me think of Hertzfeld's Rejected, also known as Rejected Cartoons, but I believe Rejected is the actual title. It's fairly well known by now, I think. On the off chance that you have not seen it, I strongly recommend you go on YouTube and find it, because it is amazing. And very, very funny. It's one of the examples of that, very random kind of internet humor that stuff like ASDF Movie is drawing on. In fact, ASDF Movie is, especially when it first started out, basically a lesser imitation of Rejected. Not that ASDF Movie is bad. It's another good example of that kind of humor, which is a kind of humor that's incredibly easy to do badly, so good examples are hard to come by. But Rejected is really good. Quite old, too. I'm pretty sure it's older than YouTube. I think it goes back to at least 99, 2000, somewhere in there. I might be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure. Anyway, reminded me of that, which is a good thing to be reminding me of. And, this notion of the blending of elements of different cartoons that don't go together Kind of thing that happens near the end of Rejected. But the other thing I really like there, which I feel is like the one moment that worked best, the one moment where elements of both shows came together and actually fitted, is Amethyst eating Pizza Steve. It's just perfect. The fact that she chases him off screen and we just hear it. The fact that when she walks back on screen, she burps up the glasses and then puts them on. Her commenting on it later that, she hopes it isn't a problem. Pizza Steve was kind of annoying in his interactions with Steven. But Pizza Steve is kind of an annoying character based on what I've seen of him. But Amethyst eating him was just perfect. It's a very Amethyst thing to do. Yet, one character devouring another doesn't feel out of place in Uncle Grandpa at all. So, I feel like that's the one moment where it really clicked. But then, I don't think clicking was the point. I think not clicking was the point. I mean, it's very obvious that this was sort of an introduction to Steven Universe for Uncle Grandpa viewers, but mostly an introduction to Uncle Grandpa for Steven Universe viewers. Hence, the introduction of who he is, the guided tour of his world. So, I don't think it was meant to click. I think it was just a weird crossover done to try to get people to watch another show, which I don't know if it succeeded or not. And I think they decided to take that, to take the fact there's really no reason whatsoever to put these two shows together. There's nothing they have in common except for being cartoons on the same network. I think they just decided to run with that and just have it clash through the whole thing. And I think that clash in itself produces interesting results. Like really highlighting the degree to which Uncle Grandpa is heavily influenced by, kind of the classics of Western animation, where Steven Universe is heavily influenced by kind of the classics of Westerners watching Japanese animation. I think it's likely that if you talked to Japanese people and asked them, what are the classics of anime, they'd probably eventually get to Neanderthal Evangelion, Revolutionary Girl Lieutenant, Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, all that kind of stuff. Probably they'd eventually get there, but I suspect they'd name a lot of other stuff first, starting in the 60s, rather than the 90s. But that's just because, anime was a niche thing in the United States prior to the 90s. So, most of the things that American anime viewers regard as the classics, the core things, the everybody should watch these at some point things, are from the 90s. That said, I think that's about everything I wanted to cover. So, yeah, this is 2 good, solid episodes. Say Uncle was really weird, but in an acceptable way. And I'm looking forward to continuing on. Bye!